My mother-in-law smirked as I entered family court with my 7-year-old daughter's hand in mine. "You don't stand a chance," she whispered. 30 seconds later, the judge looked up, smiled, and said, "Good morning, Colonel Harrison." The courtroom went silent. Margaret blinked twice, looked at me, then back at the judge. "You're a colonel," she murmured. I gave one small nod and turned back to my daughter. Emily was squeezing my hand so hard that her little fingers almost hurt. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. She looked up at me with nervous blue eyes. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" I forced a steady smile. "We're going to tell the truth." That was the only promise I made, because the truth was the only thing I knew for certain that morning. My name is Rebecca Harrison. I was 46 years old, and until that moment, few people in my husband's family knew what I had spent 22 years doing before I became Emily's mother. They knew I had served in the Army. They assumed I had been an office worker, a supply clerk, or some kind of administrator. I never corrected them. I was not ashamed. I wanted to leave my rank at the gate after retirement and live as a wife and mother. Perhaps I hid that part of myself too well. That early October Wednesday Nashville family court was crowded before 9. Wooden benches were crowded children colored, and lawyers hurried past through the smell of floor polish and stale coffee. Emily and I had arrived 40 minutes early. She wore the little navy dress she chose herself. "I look brave in blue," she had told me over breakfast. I kissed the top of her head. "You absolutely do." Then David and his mother walked in. Margaret Harrison entered every room as though she expected people to notice. She wore a cream pantsuit, a pearl necklace, and perfectly arranged hair. Seeing me, she announced, "Oh, Rebecca actually showed up." David stood beside her, wearing a charcoal suit I had bought for a retirement ceremony. Funny how clothes could outlive a marriage. Margaret looked around. No attorney, I did not answer. Her smile widened. "I suppose they're expensive when you don't have much left." Emily moved closer to me. Margaret noticed. "Don't worry, sweetheart. You'll be living somewhere much nicer very soon." I used every ounce of self-control. I wanted to tell her to stop speaking to my child. I wanted to say children were not prizes to be won. I knelt beside Emily. "Remember what we talked about?" She nodded. "When grown-ups argue, I don't have to." "That's my girl." Margaret rolled her eyes, still giving little speeches. David finally said, "Mom." "What? Not now." She shrugged. "I'm only being honest." Honest. That word almost made me laugh. If honesty had mattered to Margaret, we would never have been standing outside courtroom 4B. At exactly 8:55, the bailiff opened the doors. "Custody docket. Harrison versus Harrison." Emily looked up at me again. I took a slow breath. "We're ready." At least, I hoped we were. 3 years earlier, if anyone had told me I would one day fight my own husband for custody of our daughter, I would have called them crazy. Back then, I believed David Harrison was the safest choice I had ever made. I could not have been more wrong. 3 years earlier, my life looked so ordinary that I honestly believed the hardest chapters were behind me. I had retired from the Army after 22 years. My retirement ceremony took place at Fort Campbell on a bright spring morning. There were speeches, handshakes, a folded flag, and far more photographs than I wanted. My parents drove down from Kentucky, and my younger brother surprised me with barbecue from my favorite place in Clarksville. When someone called me Colonel Harrison that day, the title already felt distant. I told one of my former officers, "Tomorrow, I'm just Rebecca." At the time, I meant it. After 2 decades of deployments, command meetings, emergency logistics, and nights in temporary housing, I wanted a simple life, a home, a family. A little girl who knew her mother would be present for every birthday. David seemed to want the same things. We met 6 months after my retirement at a fundraising dinner for wounded veterans in Franklin, Tennessee. I was organizing items for the silent auction. He attended because his construction company had donated building materials for a housing project. He was charming without trying too hard, funny, patient, and thoughtful enough to refill my coffee before I noticed the cup was empty. On our 3rd date, he asked what I had done in the Army. "Logistics," I said. He laughed. "That sounds important." It mostly means solving problems before everyone else notices they're happening. I like that. I gave him the short version. I never mentioned my rank awards or command responsibilities. To me, that life was over. David did not ask for more, and I appreciated that. We married 18 months later in a small church outside Franklin. 60 guests joined us at a community center reception of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and peach cobbler. My army friends joked that I had traded precision for comfort. They were right. When Emily was born 2 years later, I believed I had finally found the life I had dreamed about during lonely nights overseas. Everything changed so gradually that I almost missed it. It began with small comments. "You don't have to organize everything like a military operation," David would joke. Then Margaret began stopping by without calling. She opened my refrigerator, rearranged my kitchen cabinets, and told me Emily's bedtime was too early. One afternoon, she watched me fold laundry and said, "The Army may have taught you discipline, but raising a family is completely different." I smiled politely. "I'm learning every day." She patted my shoulder. "I hope so." I tried to ignore her and refused to turn every disagreement into battle. David rarely defended me. Instead, he sighed and said, "Mom means well." If Margaret criticized my cooking, Mom meant well. If she questioned how I disciplined Emily, Mom meant well. If she suggested I was wasting David's money because I had stopped consulting after Emily was born, Mom meant well. After one visit, I asked, "Do you notice how she talks to me?" He looked up from the television. "Rebecca, why do you always assume she's attacking you?" "I don't." "Then let it go." I wanted to. I called it a rough season and believed patience would help. I was protecting not my marriage, but the marriage I wished existed. The first real crack did not come from an argument. It came from our checking account. One Tuesday while Emily was in first grade, I paid bills. Tuesdays meant cafeteria grilled cheese and tomato soup. I logged into our joint account with a cup of coffee beside me and knew the balance was wrong. Not hundreds, nearly $80,000 was gone. I refreshed twice and opened the transaction history. There had been a wire transfer 2 weeks earlier, another 3 days later, and a third the following Monday. Together, they erased years of savings. When David came home, I met him in the kitchen. "Did the bank make an error?" He loosened his tie. "What error?" "The savings account." He froze for a fraction of a second. It was enough. "I moved the money," he said. "You what?" "I moved it." "Without telling me?" "It's still our money. It isn't in our account anymore." He opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water as if discussing weather. "I've been restructuring things." "David, that's $80,000. I know exactly how much it is." "Then why didn't you tell me?" He twisted off the cap. "Because you'd overreact." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I could not believe him. "You emptied our savings. I protected it." "From whom?" He looked directly at me. "From uncertainty." I understood 3 days later. Emily had gymnastics on Thursday evenings. David would pick her up while I had a parent conference at school. The meeting ended early, and I planned an ice cream surprise. Instead, I found myself pulling into Margaret's driveway. David's truck was already there. So was Emily's little backpack. The front window was slightly open. Near the porch, I heard Margaret. "You've waited long enough," David sighed. "I know." "Then file the papers." "I'm going to." "And Emily." A pause. "We'll ask for primary custody." My heart began pounding. Margaret continued. "Rebecca has no chance if we do this correctly." David said nothing. "She's been out of the workforce for years," Margaret said. "She retired." "Exactly. The judge will see a mother with no current career and a stable father who can provide." I gripped the porch railing until my knuckles turned white. Then Margaret said the words that made my stomach drop. "We'll also raise concerns about her military service." David's voice lowered. "Mom, people hear Army and think trauma. She doesn't have PTSD. That doesn't mean we can't ask questions." After a long silence, David said, "Our attorney said it could influence the custody evaluation." He knew it was false, yet would use it. I backed away unseen, and barely remember driving home. I remember sitting in my driveway after dark while Emily slept in her car seat, holding the stuffed rabbit she had carried everywhere since preschool. After putting her to bed, I cried harder than I had in years. Not because my marriage was ending, but because the man I loved was preparing to use our daughter as a weapon. The divorce papers arrived 6 days later. I was not surprised, but one page stopped me cold. Petition for sole physical custody. I spent nearly an hour reading every accusation. Most were completely false. I understood this was not simply a divorce, it was a campaign. Divorce brought out the worst in them. Within 2 weeks, our joint credit card was frozen. David had opened a checking account in his own name months earlier. Utility payments that had always cleared automatically began bouncing. I stood in line at the electric company in Franklin with a folder of paperwork, wondering how lifelong vows became arguments over water bills. Emily noticed everything. Children always do. One evening, while I made macaroni and cheese, she asked, "Mom, are we poor now?" That hurt more than the divorce papers. No, sweetheart. Then why do you look at prices every time we go to the grocery store? Because I had started buying store brands. Because I no longer put steak in the cart. Every dollar mattered, but that burden was mine. We're just being smart with our money, I told her. She accepted the answer. Children trust us before we earn it. The following Monday, I met with my second attorney. The first quoted almost $30,000 for trial preparation. The second reviewed my papers and said, "Rebecca, you have a strong case." Hope rose. Then he slid a yellow legal pad across the desk. His estimated fees were nearly $22,000. I thanked him, then cried in a Kroger parking lot before buying milk and cereal. Over the next month, I sold almost everything that was not tied to an irreplaceable memory. I sold the antique Ford pickup my father and I had restored together. I sold my grandmother's crystal and jewelry from a drawer. Each sale was another goodbye. One Saturday, Emily came into the garage as a man drove away in my father's old truck. "Are we selling Grandpa's truck?" I nodded. She slipped her hand into mine. I liked that truck. So did I. She leaned against me without asking anything else. Sometimes a child knows silence is kinder. That was only part of it. David's attorney filed motion after motion. He requested financial records, medical records, military records, and even old counseling notes from the period after my retirement. One afternoon, I covered the dining table with bank statements, tax returns, school records, and military paperwork. Emily wandered in with a coloring book. "That's a lot of homework." I laughed for the first time all week. "It sure is." She climbed into my lap. "Are you going to win?" I wanted to promise everything, but the Army taught me not to promise what I could not control. "I'm going to fight as hard as I can." She smiled. "I know." That evening, my phone rang. The caller ID read Colonel James Whitaker, my former brigade commander. We had not spoken in almost 4 years. "Rebecca," he said warmly, "I heard what's happening. I've got people who would fly to Tennessee tomorrow if you needed them." "I know you would." "So, what's the plan?" I looked around at the mountain of paperwork. After a pause, I said, "I'm going to beat them the same way we solved every impossible mission. How's that?" "Preparation." He laughed. "I was hoping you'd say that." I wanted no favors, only enough proof for truth to stand. After 22 Army years, I wanted anonymity. I packed my uniforms in garment bags, folded away my medals, and stored every plaque and certificate in the attic. I was proud, but that chapter was over. I wanted Emily to know me as the mother who packed her lunches and volunteered for field trips, not as the officer who had solved supply crises across the world. David knew I retired as an officer and had worked in logistics. That was all. He never asked what rank I held or what my responsibilities had been. Neither did Margaret. She mistook silence for insignificance, and I let her. A week before the final custody hearing, Colonel Whitaker called again. "Have you changed your mind?" "About what?" "Accepting help." "I appreciate it, but I don't want anyone calling judges or politicians." He laughed. "You know I'd never do that." "I know. We have another idea. The court doesn't need favors. It needs facts. I agreed. 2 days later, a thick overnight envelope arrived from Fort Campbell. Inside were certified copies of my service record, performance evaluations, command assignments, letters of commendation, and deployment history. Nothing classified, nothing dramatic. Just official records showing exactly who I had been for 22 years. At the bottom was a handwritten envelope. Rebecca, you won't need me in court, but if you need advice, call anytime. Tom. Tom Richards was a retired colonel and former JAG officer. We had served together during a humanitarian operation after severe flooding along the Mississippi. After leaving active duty, he became an attorney. When I called that evening, he answered on the second ring. About time. You knew I'd call. I knew you'd at least read the note. For 2 hours, he taught me procedure, not strategy. When the other attorney objects, don't panic. I won't. If you don't understand a question, I'll ask for clarification. Exactly. Then he paused. Rebecca, you're not walking into battle. I know. This is not about defeating somebody. It's about protecting Emily. That's the mission. Mission. I had not used that word in years. It steadied me. Over several nights after Emily slept, I turned the dining room into a command center. I filled legal pads and organized tab binders. I ordered every statement, email, school record, and text by date. If David's attorney asked a question, I wanted every answer within reach. One night, Emily came downstairs in dinosaur pajamas, rubbing her eyes. What are you doing up? I had a bad dream. She climbed into my lap and looked at the stacks of binders. Is that for court? It is. Then she asked, what if the judge doesn't believe you? I looked at the child who trusted me completely. I can't decide what someone else believes. She frowned. So what can you do? I can tell the truth. She considered that, then nodded. Truth's pretty strong. I kissed her hair. It usually is. The night before court, after Emily slept, I stood in the attic looking at the garment bag holding my army dress uniform. I considered taking it, then zipped it shut. I was not going to court as a colonel. I was going as Emily's mother. The next morning at 8:55 sharp, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors, and Emily and I walked inside, hand in hand. Once seated, every cough and turned page echoed. Emily sat beside me, swinging her legs so that her shiny black shoes barely missed the floor. She clutched her preschool rabbit. Across the aisle, David sat beside his attorney, Mark Ellison, a well-known Nashville family lawyer. Margaret sat behind them in charity luncheon clothes. She caught my eye and smiled with confidence. She thought the day was theirs. The bailiff called, "All rise." Judge Harold Simmons entered through a side door. He had silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and unreadable calm. He placed a folder on the bench, adjusted his glasses, and reviewed the docket. Then he looked up, and our eyes met. His expression softened. "Good morning, Colonel Harrison." Nobody moved. The room inhaled. Margaret frowned. David stared at me, then at the judge. Even Mr. Ellison blinked. "Good morning, Your Honor," I replied. Judge Simmons nodded once and returned to the file. No special treatment, only professional recognition from years before. Behind me, Margaret whispered, "You're a colonel." I retired several years ago. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked at David. "You didn't know?" David stared at me. No. Realization crossed his face. Rank guaranteed nothing in family court. He had discovered a life he never cared to understand. Judge Simmons cleared his throat. "Counsel, are we ready to proceed?" Mr. Ellison stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Because I was representing myself, I rose too. "Ready, Your Honor." Margaret laughed under her breath. I ignored her. Mr. Ellison presented David's case. For 30 minutes, he described a stranger, a retired military officer who struggled to adjust to civilian life, a rigid mother who lacked emotional flexibility, someone supposedly unstable beneath a controlled appearance. When he finished, Judge Simmons turned to me. "Mrs. Harrison." I stood. Mr. Ellison handed over a folder. "I'd like to begin with Exhibit 4. Before he could continue, I said, "Your Honor, before addressing Exhibit 4, May I ask Mr. Harrison one question?
You may.
David took the witness stand. He looked uncertain rather than frightened. I approached the podium with one yellow legal pad. No drama or raised voice. David, you testified that I withdrew from family life after retiring from the Army.
Yes.
Who attended every parent-teacher conference Emily has ever had? He hesitated.
You did.
Who coached her soccer team for 2 seasons?
You.
Who volunteered in her classroom every Friday?
You.
I paused. Then when exactly did I withdraw from family life? He looked toward his attorney, but Mr. Ellison stayed silent.
I meant emotionally, David said.
I see. I opened a binder. Would you like me to read the text message you sent after one of those parent-teacher conferences? He shifted.
No.
I turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 12. Judge Simmons read it, one eyebrow lifting. Facts, not rank, shifted the room. Exhibit 12 is admitted, the judge said. Mr. Ellison rose.
Objection. The message does not establish the witness's overall parenting ability.
It establishes the context of previous testimony, Judge Simmons replied.
Overruled. One question at a time.
It worked for supply convoys and second-grade math. Solving everything at once solved nothing. I faced David again. You testified that I struggled emotionally after leaving the Army.
Yes.
When was I diagnosed with PTSD? He frowned.
I don't know.
Did any doctor ever tell you I had PTSD?
No.
Did you attend any appointment where that diagnosis was made?
No.
Because it never happened. He hesitated. Correct. The room stilled. I wanted facts, not humiliation. Mr. Ellison redirected the questions toward my retirement, suggesting that leaving a structured military career had made civilian life difficult. That was true.
Were there days you felt lost?
Yes.
Were there days you questioned your identity?
Absolutely. He smiled.
And during that period, you were raising a young child.
I was. So you agree that period was emotionally challenging?
It was.
No further questions. He wanted struggle to sound like instability. When it was my turn, I returned to the podium. Your Honor, may I clarify?
You may.
Retiring after 22 years was difficult. So was becoming a first-time mother. A few smiled. Retirement is probably difficult for teachers, police officers, nurses, business owners, or anyone who spends decades building a career. The question is whether we keep showing up for those who depend on us. Then I picked up another binder. Your Honor, I'd like to discuss the marital savings account. Mr. Ellison shifted in his chair. I submitted certified bank statements showing 3 large transfers made by David without my knowledge. Dates and account numbers matched. I asked David, when did you first decide to move these funds? He glanced at his attorney.
I don't remember.
You don't remember transferring nearly $80,000? It was part of financial planning. I opened another folder. Perhaps this email will refresh your memory. Mr. Ellison turned sharply toward me. Discovery covered the email David sent his advisor nearly 4 months before filing. One sentence was highlighted. I want everything separated before she realizes what's happening. David's face lost color. Margaret leaned forward.
That's taken out of context, she said.
Judge Simmons looked over his glasses.
Mrs. Harrison, you are not a party on the witness stand.
She sat back, visibly frustrated. I continued. Your Honor, I'd also like to introduce phone records. Mr. Ellison stood.
On what basis they establish repeated communication between Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Margaret Harrison immediately before and after each financial transfer?
The judge accepted the records. Margaret's confident smile vanished. Each item was ordinary. Together, they fit. Their story collapsed beneath its contradictions. By early afternoon, the courtroom no longer felt like David's stage. Everyone awaited the next fact. Judge Simmons called a 15-minute recess. I stayed seated as others left. My shoulders ached, and my mouth was dry. Self-representation meant carrying every file and fearing one forgotten detail.
Emily came from the children's waiting area with her coloring book under one arm. Yes, sweetheart. She wrapped both arms around my waist. I think you're doing really good. I laughed softly. You heard about 5 minutes of grown-up talking. I know, but Grandpa says people tell the truth with how they act. I smiled. My dad is a smart man. He really is. Her words steadied me more than legal advice. Across the hall, David spoke quietly with Mr. Ellison. Margaret was no longer talking. She paced and glanced at me with frustration. The bailiff called us back inside. Once settled, Judge Simmons said, "Mrs. Harrison, you may continue." Thank you, Your Honor. I lifted my final binder. This portion concerned statements made in Mr. Harrison's custody petition. Mr. Ellison rose immediately. Your Honor, we have already addressed those allegations. We addressed the conclusions, I said. I'd like to address how they were created. Judge Simmons nodded. Proceed. I turned to David. In your sworn filing, you stated that I frequently left Emily unattended because I was emotionally withdrawn. Yes. What date did that happen? He hesitated. I don't remember the exact date. Can you name one occasion? Silence. You also stated that Emily's teacher expressed concerns about my parenting. That's what I was told. By whom? He looked toward his attorney. My mother. No further questions. I faced the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a letter from Emily's classroom teacher. Judge Simmons read it for almost a full minute. The letter was simple. Rebecca Harrison has been one of the most consistently involved parents I have worked with in 23 years of teaching. Emily arrives prepared, feels safe, and clearly shares a loving relationship with her mother. At no time have I expressed concerns about Mrs. Harrison's parenting. The judge placed the letter on the bench and looked at David. Mr. Harrison, did your daughter's teacher ever tell you Mrs. Harrison was an unfit parent? David swallowed. No. So that statement in your petition, it came from my mother. The room went silent. Judge Simmons turned to Margaret. Mrs. Margaret Harrison? She stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Did you tell your son that Emily's teacher questioned Mrs. Harrison's parenting? Margaret raised her chin. I may have misunderstood a conversation. I opened my final folder. Your Honor, I have one last exhibit. It was a voicemail Margaret had accidentally left on my phone months earlier. The clerk played it aloud. Margaret's voice filled the room. David, if we're going to win custody, stop being nice. The judge doesn't know Rebecca. We just have to make her sound unstable long enough. No one moved. When the recording ended, Judge Simmons removed his glasses. He looked at Margaret, then David. Mrs. Harrison, this court takes false allegations involving a child's welfare extremely seriously. Margaret opened her mouth. The judge raised one hand. No, ma'am. She sat down. For once, she had nothing to say. Judge Simmons reviewed his notes and folded his hands. Custody decisions are not intended to reward one parent or punish another, he said. They exist for one purpose, the best interests of the child. I looked at Emily. She sat beside the court-appointed child advocate, coloring another picture. Unaware these minutes would shape her childhood. During today's hearing, the judge continued, this court heard allegations concerning Mrs. Harrison's emotional stability. None were supported by credible evidence. Mr. Ellison lowered his eyes. We also received documentary evidence showing that Mr. Harrison transferred substantial marital assets without his wife's knowledge while preparing for divorce. David stared at the floor. More concerning, the court heard evidence of an intentional effort to create a false narrative regarding Mrs. Harrison's ability to parent. Even Margaret stayed still. Judge Simmons closed the file. Mrs. Harrison. Yes, Your Honor. I have reviewed school records, medical records, testimony, financial documents, and the recommendation of the court-appointed evaluator. Every independent source describes you as a consistent, engaged, and loving parent. My throat tightened. For months, I had wondered whether I failed unknowingly. His evidence-based words let me breathe. Therefore, Judge Simmons said, and the room leaned forward. This court awards primary physical custody of Emily Harrison to her mother, Rebecca Harrison. I closed my eyes for 1 second to steady myself. "Mom," Emily said. I smiled through tears. "We're going home together." She jumped from her chair and wrapped both arms around me. "I knew it. I hoped so." Across the aisle, David lowered his head into his hands. He neither argued nor interrupted. Judge Simmons continued. "Mr. Harrison will receive parenting time according to the attached schedule." His expression hardened. "I strongly encourage both parents to remember that Emily deserves honesty, not conflict. And I suggest that future decisions regarding your daughter be made independently." He looked directly at David. Margaret appeared ready to object, but instead, she picked up her purse and walked out without a word. I had never seen her leave quietly. Reporters waiting for an unrelated criminal hearing glanced over, but no one stopped us. Exactly as I wanted. As Emily and I reached the steps, David caught up. "Rebecca." I turned. "I owe you an apology. I should have trusted you." His voice sounded small. "You should have trusted the mother of your daughter." He nodded. "I know. I won't keep Emily from you. But I will not let anyone teach her that lies are an acceptable way to win." "I understand." For once, I believed him. Emily slipped her hand into mine. "Can we get ice cream?" I laughed. "I think we earned 2 scoops." As we walked to the parking lot, she grinned up at me. "So, were you really a colonel?" "I was." She squeezed my hand. "I think that's pretty cool." It meant more than any medal. A year changes what matters. 12 months after the custody hearing, my life looked nothing like it had when I entered courtroom 4B. The house felt lighter. Nothing physical changed. We still had the same front porch, the same squeaky hallway floor, and the same maple tree outside Emily's bedroom. But the tension was gone. Weekday mornings finally felt like home. I woke before 6 started coffee and packed her lunch while she searched for the shoe or homework assignment that had mysteriously vanished overnight. Some mornings she sang. Others she arrived messy-haired and too tired for multiplication. After everything ordinary became my favorite gift. I also went back to work, but not to the Army. That chapter had ended. I accepted a part-time position mentoring military spouses preparing for civilian careers or facing difficult family transitions. Many shared my old fear. Who am I if I am no longer wearing the uniform? I listened, then shared what I learned. The uniform teaches you how to serve. It does not decide who you are after you hang it up. They helped me too. David remained part of Emily's life. The schedule worked better than expected. To his credit, he never missed a weekend. He came to school concerts, soccer games, and birthday parties. He slowly became the father Emily deserved. We never regained closeness, but respect was enough. Margaret faded quietly into the background. She saw Emily occasionally, but stopped interfering. Whether court changed her or only taught consequences, I stopped wondering. One Saturday afternoon, Emily and I were cleaning the attic when she found an old green garment bag behind the Christmas decorations. She dragged it across the floor. "Mom, what is this?" She unzipped it carefully. Inside hung my army dress uniform with the silver eagle insignia ribbons and medals. Her eyes widened. "This is what you wore?" "It is. Why didn't you ever tell me?" I sat beside her on the attic floor. "I didn't want you to think those things were the most important part of my life. Aren't they?" I smiled. "No. What is?" I answered. "You." She leaned against my shoulder. "I still think you looked pretty cool." I laughed. "It was a sharp uniform. You should wear it for Halloween." "I think I'm a little old for that." "No way!" We laughed until our stomachs hurt. Then I understood the real victory. Not court rank or proving Margaret wrong. It was that Emily had seen strength without bitterness. She saw facts defeat anger and learned dignity outlasts revenge. The Army taught me how to lead under pressure, but becoming Emily's mother taught me why that mattered. Rank opened doors during my career. Love carried me through the hardest battle of my life. If you have ever been underestimated or judged by only one chapter of your story, remember this. Other people do not get to decide your worth. You do. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will join me again for another one. The end.